Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Volo, Itinerant Scholar, a mono-blue background commander from Commander Legends, Battle for Baldur's Gate. And given Volo lets you choose a background enchantment as a secondary commander, I've chosen Haunted One as Volo's background, making this a Dimir deck. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this price won't include the cost of shipping, taxes, or the like. But regardless, let's get into this deck. So, Volo, Itinerant Scholar is a 2/3 legendary human wizard costing 2 generic and a blue to cast. And, when Volo enters the battlefield, you create a hexproof legendary colorless artifact token called Volo's Journal, which, whenever you cast a creature spell, you note one of its creature types that hasn't been noted before, and then Volo can be tapped for 2 generic mana to draw a card for each creature type noted on Volo's Journal. So on the face of it, Volo makes a draw engine. Our second commander is Haunted One, a legendary background enchantment for 2 generic and a black mana. And it gives our commander creatures, whenever this creature becomes tapped, it and other creatures you control that share a creature type with it get +2/+0 and gain Undying until the end of the turn, where Undying brings your creatures back to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 counter on it, provided that it died with no +1/+1 counters on it, giving our creatures some staying power. So in combination, we have a draw engine that can give our creatures life insurance, letting us more aggressively swing with our creatures as they'll return to us more powerful if killed in action the first time around. But let's get more into the specifics of what this deck wants to do. To start, we have 2 semi-opposing needs in this deck. Volo requires a wide range of creature types to note in his journal, as the type can only be used once. But Haunted One requires our creatures to share a type with Volo to get the power buffs and Undying. So to balance this, we're going to load our decks with a bunch of non-wizard humans, so things such as a human cleric, a human rogue, and non-human wizards, such as a zombie wizard, to get both overlapping and new creature types. However, we can also make use of some creatures with Changeling, as these creatures have all creature types, including human and wizard, but can also let us note any creature type we want in Volo's Journal when we cast it, including types that we don't have explicitly represented in this deck. With Undying gained from either drawing or attacking with Volo, we'll aim to go a bit wide and aggressively swing with our creatures, as killing them will only make them stronger. And we'll have a bunch of fun effects based around drawing or Undying, such as untapping effects so we can draw multiple times, no max hand size so we can keep everything we draw, counter removal so we can access Undying multiple times on the same creature, and other things. But at this point, I should just start getting into the 99 of this deck, so let's jump into it, starting with our ramp. I'll start with some land-based ramp with Wayfarer's Bauble and Navigation Orb, the former letting you tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the latter searching for 2 basics and or gate lands which are revealed, and we put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other goes into our hand. As usual with Navigation Orb, I've included a set of 4 gate lands, notably Gone Gate, which lets other gates enter untapped while tapping for the colors our other gates could produce, and thus I suggest always tutoring and putting this gate onto the battlefield tapped, along with 3 gates that can tap for Dimir colors, notably Dimir Guild Gate, Sea Gate, and Black Dragon Gate. Then we have Mindstone and Liquid Metal Torque as generic producing mana rocks. Sky Diamond and Charcoal Diamond will tap for blue and black mana respectively. Dimir Signet will convert 1 mana into a black and a blue mana. And Talisman of Dominance will tap for generic, or could tap for a blue or a black mana at the cost of pinging yourself for 1 damage. Then Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least one of our colors, and Arcane Signet will tap for black or blue as we need. And for some mana rocks with potentially useful extra effects, Patriarch Seal can tap for any colored mana, or it could be used to untap a target legendary creature we control. And we have Honor Warren Shaku and Relic of Legends, the former tapping for generic mana, and the latter tapping for colored mana, but both rocks can let us tap an untapped legendary creature we control for more mana, Shaku through untapping itself for tapping a creature, and the latter just giving you a mana for it. But this can be useful as, provided Volo is untapped, we can tap Volo at any time to give our creatures Undying without the limitations of either needing to be in our combat or having to pay 2 mana to draw. But with that, let's start to look at some of the humans and wizards we have in this deck. First up, we have Invisible Stalker, an unblockable 1/1 human rogue with hexproof. And nearly as unblockable is Lu Sun, Scholar General, a human soldier with horsemanship, meaning it can only be blocked with creatures with horsemanship, and when it deals damage to an opponent, you can draw a card. Criddle of Baldur's Gate is a human elf rogue that lets you pay 2 generic when you attack to make a target creature unblockable for the turn. while also making an opponent lose a life and mill a card when it deals combat damage to them, while also having us gain a life and scry 1. Zulaport Cutthroat is a human rogue ally that has each opponent lose a life and yourself gain 1 whenever it or another creature you control dies. And Sir Conrad the Grim is a human knight that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever another creature dies. Another creature is put into a graveyard from somewhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, while having the activated ability to have everyone mill 1. Archetype of Imagination is a human wizard that gives all of our creatures flying, and makes it so our opponent's creatures lose and cannot gain flying. And Kosi's Trickster is a little bit of a weird one. It's a merfolk wizard that grows whenever an opponent shuffles their library. Realm White is a Vadalcan wizard that has us choose a basic land type when it enters the battlefield, and then our lands gain that basic land type in addition to their other types. Then Thalicos Seer is a Thalicos wizard with Shadow, so it can only block and be blocked by creatures with Shadow, so like with Horsemanship, this is unlikely to be blocked. And when it leaves the battlefield, you can draw a card. Then Moonfolk Puzzlemaker is a Moonfolk wizard with flying and has you scry 1 whenever it becomes tapped. Burikos, Party Leader, is an Orc Cleric Rogue Warrior Wizard that has the defending player it attacks lose X life and yourself make X treasure tokens, with X being the number of creatures in your party. A mechanic that counts up to 4 unique creatures consisting of a Rogue, a Wizard, a Cleric, and a Warrior. So between Volo as a Wizard and Burikos filling any of the other 3 creature types, X should be at least 2 for us. And Puppeteer Click is a flying fairy wizard that lets you steal a creature card from an opponent's graveyard and put it onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste so you can use it that turn, but it's exiled at the start of your next end step. But what's more fun is that it has Persist, which is sort of the inverse of Undying, where a Persist creature is returned to the battlefield under your control with a -1/-1 counter on it, provided it died with no -1/-1 counters on it. Given we plan on giving Undying to our creatures with Volo and Haunted One, the fact that +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters cancel each other out, and only Persist or Undying would actually resolve, whichever one you choose to resolve first, something like Puppeteer Click would be hard to remove in a deck like this, outside of our opponents using exiling effects. But with that start on our humans and wizards, let's go over our Shapeshifters, which can let us note any of the evergreen creature types in Volo's journal when cast. Universal Automaton, Moth Dust Changeling, and Changeling Outcast are all 1/1 Shapeshifters for 1 mana. Notably, Changeling Outcast can neither block nor be blocked. Amoeboid Changeling can be tapped to make a target creature gain or lose all creature types until the end of the turn. Skeletal Changeling can be regenerated for 1 and a black, in case it dies with a +1/+1 counter on it. Venomous Changeling is a 1/3 with Death Touch, which can make it a reasonably scary blocker. Mistwalker is a 1/4 flying changeling, and Graveshifter lets you return a target creature card from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield. Then Litjara Kinseekers is a 2/4 changeling that gains a +1/+1 counter and lets you scry 1 if you control 3 or more creatures with the same creature type when it enters the battlefield. And finally, Bloodline Pretender has you choose a creature type when it enters the battlefield, and then it gains +1/+1 counters whenever another creature of that chosen type enters the battlefield under your control. Now, I'd like to talk about a few creatures that we can use to untap Volo so we could potentially access the draw and or Undying abilities again. Kelpie Guide is the only one of these creatures that doesn't share a creature type with Volo, as it is a 2/2 beast that can be tapped to untap one of our permanents. But we also have Clever Conjurer, a Gnome Wizard, and Vizier of Tumbling Sands and Eorith of the Healing House, both of which are human clerics, but all of which can be tapped to untap another target permanent. It's also important to note that Clever Conjurer can only do this at sorcery speed, however. Now, given that we plan on drawing a ton with Volo, let's go over a handful of cards that benefit from us drawing. Probably the least potent of these is going to be Jace's Projection. It's a 2/2 Wizard Illusion that gets +1/+1 counters whenever you draw. Then we have Ominous Seas, which gets a Foreshadow counter whenever you draw a card, and you can remove 8 of these Foreshadow counters to create an 8/8 Kraken creature token. Psychosis Crawler is a great way for us to drain our opponent's life totals, as it makes each opponent lose 1 life whenever you draw a card, and it happens to have power and toughness equal to the number of cards in your hand. And the last set of cards that will trigger off of us drawing are Teferi's Tutelage, Sphinx's Tutelage, and Psychic Corrosion, each of which will have opponents mill when we draw. Teferi's Tutelage and Sphinx's Tutelage have a target opponent mill 2 whenever we draw a card, and Sphinx's Tutelage can repeat this process if the chosen opponent milled 2 non-land cards that share a color. And Psychic Corrosion has each opponent mill 2 whenever we draw a card. Now, I'd like to quickly go over a few types of effects that are only represented by 2 or 3 cards in this deck. First up are some spells that give us an unlimited hand size, including Thought Vessel, Decanter of Endless Water, and Wizard class, the first two being mana rocks, and the latter an enchantment that can have mana paid into it to get additional effects, including drawing 2 and growing a target creature whenever we draw a card. Up next are Soul Diviner and Retribution of the Ancients. Since we're looking to use Undying as a form of protection for our creatures, and Undying only works if we have no +1/+1 counters on the creature when it dies, these two cards can let us remove counters from our creatures, which could be used to reset for Undying, while giving us some benefits for removing those counters. In this case, drawing for Soul Diviner, and temporarily weakening or just killing off a creature with Retribution of the Ancients. And the last effect type here is Spell Copying, and that's through Reflections of Littjara and Archmage of Echoes. Reflections of Littjara has you choose a creature type when it enters the battlefield, and then you copy spells that you cast of that chosen type. And Archmage of Echoes is a 4/4 fairy wizard with flying and ward 2 that has you copy the fairy and wizard spells that you cast. But with that, let's start looking at the spells that we can use to interact with our opponents and what they're doing on their side of the board. First up is Step Through, an admittedly mana expensive piece of interaction that bounces 2 target creatures to their owner's hands. But it's also here because it has wizard cycling, allowing you to discard Step Through and tutor a wizard card into your hand after revealing it. And then Wizard's Retort lets you counter a target spell, and given how many wizards we have in this deck, which includes our commander, we'll almost always be paying the same amount of mana as Counterspell for Wizard's Retort, of which we also have Counterspell, along with the slightly less efficient Cancel for countering any target spell. And then Lose Focus counters a target spell unless its caster pays 2 generic mana, but Lose Focus can be replicated for 1 blue mana, making this a relatively decent way to counter a spell that an opponent's nearly tapped out for. Now for some destruction effects, we have Go for the Throat and Doomblade, which destroy non-artifact and non-black creatures, respectively. Feed the Swarm lets you destroy a target creature or enchantment, though you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. And Exterminate has you destroy a target creature, and that creature's controller loses 3 life. It also has Replicate to make copies of the spell, which you can choose new targets for the cost of tapping an untapped Dalek that you control. And while we don't explicitly have any Daleks in this deck, any of our Shapeshifters from earlier also have the Dalek creature type and could be tapped to replicate Exterminate. And finally, if things get a little out of hand, we have a couple of creature board wipes with Decree of Pain and Black Sun Zenith. Decree of Pain destroys all creatures and they can't be regenerated, and has you draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. Or it could be cycled to give every creature -2/-2 as a board wipe for weenies. And Black Sun Zenith works really well in this deck as we plan on skirting death using Undying, as Black Sun Zenith works by putting X -1/-1 counters on each creature. So even if our creatures had +1/+1 counters on them when you cast Black Sun Zenith, by the time this spell has killed the creature, and provided Volo was tapped to give them Undying, they wouldn't have those counters on them when they die, and Undying would trigger again. Of course, our creatures could be returned from Decree of Pain as well through Undying, but that only happens if they didn't have +1/+1 counters on them to begin with. But at this point, we've talked over each of the spells in this deck, so let's start going over our land base. As mentioned in Ramp, we have a small collection of gate lands with Gond Gate, Sea Gate, Black Dragon Gate, and Dimir Guild Gate. Then we have a few land tutor lands with Promising Vein, Shire Terrace, and Myriad Landscape, each tapping for generic, and the first 2 can be used to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the last can tutor 2 basics sharing the same land type onto the battlefield tapped. Then for some dual tap lands, we have Sunken Hollow, entering untapped if you control at least 2 basic lands, Choked Estuary, a reveal land, Darkwater Catacombs, which converts 1 mana into a blue and a black mana, Dismal Backwater, a life gain land, Temple of Deceit, a scry land, and Dimir Aqueduct, a bounce land. Then we have Path of Ancestry and Command Tower, which will tap for any color we could need. Path of Ancestry also lets you scry 1 if mana from it was used to cast a creature that shares a creature type with our commander. Then Riptide Laboratory taps for generic, but can let us bounce a wizard we control back to its owner's hand. Rogue's Passage can let us ensure that at least 1 creature gets through on an opponent. And Reliquary Tower is another way for us to have no maximum hand size. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 10 islands and 7 swamps, as this deck has a bit more of a lean towards blue mana pips than black. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44 at the time of recording, including our basics at 10 cents each, but this price won't count the cost of shipping or any other potential costs. And before I close out this video, I'd like to go over a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you wish to upgrade this deck with a bit higher budget. Fate Stitcher is a zombie wizard that can be tapped to tap or untap another permanent, and I'd likely swap Kelpie Guide out for it, as Kelpie Guide is neither a human nor a wizard. But we also have Puppet Strings and Freed from the Reel, which could be used to tap or untap a permanent, likely Volo. Nesting Grounds is another way that we can move counters off of our creatures to regain access to Undying. Glenalandra Archmage can be sacrificed to counter a target non-creature spell, and it has Persist similar to Puppeteer Click, so with the Undying effect on top of it, this could be a very difficult spell for an opponent to remove without using an exiling effect. And speaking on Persist, the last card I'd like to mention is Cauldron of Souls, which can be tapped for no extra cost to give any number of our creatures Persist. But with that all being said, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and consider subscribing if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.